To now start the recording and hand off to Anthena.
Great, thank you, Jumana. As Jumana said, my name is Anthena Gore. I am the Program Director of Urban Outreach at Midwest Environmental Justice Network. I'm joined by my colleagues, of course, Jumana Vasi, the Director of the Thriving Communities Grantmaking Program, Ryan Alanese, who is the Director of Rural and Remote Outreach, Tori Solis, who is the Climate Coordinator at NDN. She's in charge of the Tribal Nation and Indigenous Outreach. We also have Kyla Rathjen from the Minneapolis Foundation, working in the finance office, who may be able to answer questions about budget and things related to that. So at any time, colleagues of mine jump in if you have answers or responses to the questions, and I will now open the floor to any questions that the audience may have.
Anthena, I will ask you a question while we wait for folks to get warmed up. So we know the first deadline was January 31st, and those grants submitted till that deadline are being considered. Can you remind me when the next deadline is? And yeah, can you remind me when the next deadline is?
That's a good question, Jumana, and maybe you can confirm for me if I have the right answer. I've heard the date March 30. Is that correct for the next round of applications to be submitted?
Right.
Yes, so March 30 is round 2 application submission deadline. The one thing I would ask is if you have not already submitted an application and if you are working towards that deadline, if you have not already, please turn in an intake form. Those are available through the grant making portal. It would be nice to have the intake form on file, address any technical assistance questions that you may have at this time around project development or just general program related questions, just so that those two items, the intake form and the application, are not so close together. Great, Marnie.
Hi, I was just wondering if the Minneapolis Foundation has any kind of plans to maybe not expedite, but award more awards earlier in the process, while funding might be more secure. Like if you're going to like choose more applicants for awards than you planned for each quarter or something like that, just for planning purposes.
Anthena, would you like me to jump in on that one? So, Marnie, it's a great question. We've grappled with that ourselves, and one important piece of this is our internal capacity to manage those grants in keeping with the federal requirements. And so if we are able to manage more than we had originally planned, we will do so, but we will proceed really carefully. So because we know that there'll be a lot of attention. And so we had planned to accept grants based on our current capacity. And so we will only do more if we are able to do that.
Thanks for the question, Marnie. Next, and forgive me if I do not pronounce your name correctly, Nuruddin.
That's really good, actually, the pronunciation of it. My question has to do, I was like reading the FAQ, and for this grant to be determined whether my proposed project serves a disadvantaged or underserved community, we're supposed to use the EJ screen mapping tool. I clicked on the link that was provided in the FAQ, and it says the site is no longer available. Are there any alternatives provided by Minneapolis Foundation?
I would actually ask my colleague Ryan if you have any insight on that to share. Thank you.
There have been a number of organizations that downloaded the different maps. The one that we're using is EJ Screen. Other regions might be using other maps like what's called the CGEST. And so I will find that link and I will put it in the chat.
Thank you.
And let me add to that. So we formally and officially cannot direct you to a non-federal map usage. And we are awaiting guidance on exactly how to manage that. And if you would like to use the links that Ryan suggested to help confirm that it does fit in those maps and use them, you are most welcome to, but that is not an official or formal suggestion from us.
Okay.
Thank you. And Kendra.
Hi, so my question is just kind of, so this is a reimbursement based grant besides the potential of getting 10%. So like we have admin and fiscal sponsors. So I would assume that would be for like our 10%, but how exactly does the reimbursement work?
Great. So I can take a first shot at this, and then Jumana or Kyla, feel free to jump in. So the reimbursement is exactly what it sounds like. So once your grant agreement is signed, then you have the ability to start billing against the grant agreement. So that means turning in invoices to the Minneapolis Foundation. And by the way, your grant agreement is with the Minneapolis Foundation. It is not a formal agreement between your organization and the EPA or any other federal entity. So that's the first thing. Secondly, once you have your invoices, the schedule would be somewhere between 30 to 60 days to turn around those invoices on the side of the Minneapolis Foundation for reimbursement. So my, I guess one of the things I would caution organizations against is solely relying on the reimbursements to shore up your pipeline for this. I understand that's a weird thing to say, considering that the funds have a very narrow use and you'll have to stick to your scope of work, but just consider having a contingency plan for that part of the work, because we are still sort of in this back and forth place with anything coming out of the IRA. So not just for the TCGM program. So I just wanted to add that word of caution. Do with that what you will. It's not a formal recommendation, just something to think about. Kyla, any other details on the reimbursement model?
Yeah, I heard you mention something about the 10%, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, and I'll share with you what I assume that's referring to. I know our FAQs say that there's a small number of grantees who may be eligible to have 10% of their total grant funds paid up front. That is something that will be discussed on an as-needed basis, kind of in the negotiation phase of a grant. So it's not something that's promised. I think everyone should go into this grant assuming that they'd be receiving funds on a reimbursement basis. The administrative costs you mentioned, things like that can fit into the indirect cost portion of your budget. But even that would be paid as part of your reimbursement. Yeah, I think we're anticipating reimbursements happening at most monthly, but at least quarterly is what we are encouraging, so that you're not racking up tons of documentation and receipts and sending them at the end of the grant or something. We want to be able to get funds to you on a more regular basis and make that process easier for you. So it's a bit more about what you can expect.
And Kyla, how would they invoice indirect?
That's a good question. There is kind of a complicated formula, a calculation that goes into creating your actual indirect cost rate amount for each reimbursement, but it would be a percentage of the reimbursement request that you're submitting. That's something we could help you make sure you're clear about each time you're submitting, as well as at the beginning of the grant. There is a federal de minimis rate, which is 15%. That's, you can use up to 15% of that rate. Or if you have your own federally approved cost rate agreement, you can use that as well.
Thanks for the question, Kendra. Thanks, Kyla. Mara?
I have a question about if you go in an application with multiple partners and just a little more clarity on picking a fiscal agent, what organization will be the fiscal agent for the grant, and how that plays in with serving disadvantaged communities. Like, let's say one of the partners is a fiscal agent, but their actual site isn't in a disadvantaged community, but even like, so it's a few blocks away. Like, is it best to have a fiscal agent that is considered disadvantaged, or is it more about who you're serving with the project and not the geographical location?
Great. I'll take a first shot at the response. So as far as the fiscal sponsorship relationship, it's important to have the lead applicant be the organization that can adhere to the compliance requirements and to the reporting schedule. So those two things are going to be extremely important. If the partnership or coalition is formed, that's an important conversation to have before submitting the application. The fiscal sponsor organization does not have to be located inside of a disadvantaged community. It is important for the project to be taking place in a disadvantaged community, meaning that the project is community-led, community-supported, and that the benefits of the project are going directly back into that geographic area. So it's not so much about the location of the lead applicant, but more so about the benefits of the project going back into the community that is cited on your project application. Any of my colleagues care to jump in on that, or are we good to move on? Okay. Any follow-up questions about that, Mara, or was that good enough for you? Great. Okay. Not all at once. But anybody else is welcome to jump right in. Oh, go ahead, Kendra.
I'll ask another one. So I'm with a group called Muckwa, and we already submitted tier 2. But we have some questions for tier 1 and 3, just kind of about the scope of the grant. So we do a lot of like wild rice mining. So we do a lot of like soil testing, water. That's a thing we are interested in. Are there any types of testing that would not be included in that scope of the first tier, or like anything we should steer away from? And then can we use that towards, I guess, never mind, just answer my own question. I'm part of it. Because I was like, can we use it towards future? But I guess that doesn't really work with the reimbursement. Because we want to be able to set up like an ongoing testing for our organization, because pretty much all of our programs across have to do with testing and, finding better solutions for these things. So we're just kind of curious, like, are there things that we cannot test or that are outside the scope? That makes sense.
That's an interesting question. I would ask, Ryan, do you have anything you want to respond to in that before I do?
My understanding is that if it has to do with environmental, environmental study, one, there needs to also be a quality assurance plan that needs to be developed as well. So that's going to take a little bit more work. But if it's addressing an issue, like you had mentioned, wild rice or other, could be issues of air quality, then that seems to fit within the purview of this grant.
Thank you, Ryan. The only other thing I would add to that, Kendra, like you said, you sort of answered your own question. Just making sure that the project that you are applying for is achievable, meaning that it is focused for the amount of money that you are applying for and that it can be achieved within the timeline of the grant. So for tier 1 grants, we're looking at 1 year. For tiers 2 and 3, it could be up to 2 years. So this could be a good way to sort of, pilot or ground your project, but then after fall of 2027, when this program is completely done, maybe you're leveraging that for future funding. But it does, for this particular grant, these projects do, everything must be done within the timeline. Thanks for the question, and thank you, Ryan. I'll lift this up from the chat. This is an interesting question. Is the funding coming with an obligation to share the IP data collected? So is that the intellectual property data collected? Jumana, any thoughts on that?
Kyla and I are looking at each other across the screen because this is one of the pieces we need to figure out what the federal government requires and what we are able to mediate on that intellectual property and ownership. We are going to do our best to make sure that you are the sole owner of your data, and that language that we're still trying to confirm and work out. So that's not a definitive answer yet, but we'll do our best for you.
Can I just interject, because that was somebody from our organization? One of our things is we work tribally also, so we just wanted to make sure, like, if we're getting information for the tribe, it's not being sold out, kind of thing. So just kind of clarification on that. So thank you.
Let's, I think Cam's on the call. Let's make sure that that gets into the FAQs once we actually have a definitive answer to it.
Okay, the floor is still open if anybody has any other questions.
I can go again if there's nobody else. So this question is if we did for tier 3, and it's kind of, I guess, the same thing. Are there any things that are outside the scope? One of our projects we have is hemp remediation and utilizing that. So we just, before we, write this beautiful grant about hemp, we want to make sure like that fits within the scope, or, because that's kind of like a red flag for some funders. When they hear hemp or cannabis, they immediately kind of check out. So we just want to, same thing, are there outside scopes? Like, is hemp an allowable, tangible for tier 3? And like, do I need to like, we'd be using it in like soil rehabilitation in like the disadvantaged communities. So it would fit in the scope that way, but we just want to make sure that hemp isn't going to like red flag our whole program or something.
That is a very interesting question. Go ahead, Jumana.
I'm looking at Kyla as well. Kyla is doing the deep dive into our compliance requirements. I have not heard anything that would restrict us from funding a project that was related to hemp that is approved by our regional advisory committee, as long as it fits in all the other criteria. Kyla, is that also your take on it?
Yeah, that I have not seen anything mentioning that as something that's not allowable. So I would assume you could safely move ahead, but I am going to take a note of it and see if I can get any further confirmation of that for you.
This is not at all what you're asking about, but there are unallowable costs, and I think we have them in our FAQs related to lobbying. And of course, there are some construction related costs that are unallowable if you don't follow procurement practices. And so we do have a list of things, and it is less issue area as long as you can demonstrate what Anthena said, but there's a community-led priority that addresses environmental, climate, public health needs, right? All that stuff, if it's in alignment, it's not the issue area that we are seeing many constraints again. It's how you spend some of those dollars. And if we notice that in an approved application, we'll work with you to work around your budget so that you can adjust it so it is only allowable expenses. Kyla, does that seem like a reasonable response?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't see any issue areas that fall within that are unallowable, right?
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more activity in the chat, but happy to keep the floor open. Also happy to conclude the meeting if there are no more questions at this time. But while I am sort of guiding us towards wrapping up, feel free to jump in if you have a thought. So I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things. The next deadline for submissions of applications is March 30th. If you have not already, please fill out an intake form. The intake forms sort of trigger us to respond to you with some guidance. If you need guidance on your project application development, if you need help accessing resources and things of that nature. I'm also seeing a question in the chat, will the January 31st applicants be announced tomorrow if they didn't pass the grant criteria?
Not
I guess,
tomorrow. Yeah, not tomorrow. We had intended to let folks know prior to the March 30th deadline, but to be honest, with 421 applications coming through, it's been taking us longer to work through them, and there are multiple people reviewing, so it will take us some time. And so we will do our best to let folks know and give you feedback as soon as possible.
thank you. Okay, we have a couple of more questions coming through in the chat. Can we submit supporting documentation with our application? And can we be included, what can be included in construction costs, engineering, architectural consultants, etc.? So for the first question, I will say you can submit some supporting documentation, but if you have things like letters of support, we don't really have an area necessarily in the application for you to attach that separately. And we don't necessarily need like 30 letters of support. You know, it should be clearly demonstrated in your application that it is an environmental justice or public health or aligned project to achieve the grant goals. So you are allowed to submit supporting documentation, but there will be a limit on that. We've also heard feedback on the character limits. We are just sort of through this process expressing to you to be very, very clear and to maximize the dollars for a fairly focused and narrow scope. We would also just say that if you are intending on commingling funds, to be careful with that. Because if you have a project that is taking in TCGM funds and also getting money from another source, you will have to report all of that when you're reporting to us. So again, just having a focused scope specifically for these dollars would probably be the best thing. And for the second question, I guess I would direct this to Kyla. What can be included in construction cost? I know we have some of these things in our FAQ, but if you have a brief bullet point overview.
Yeah, I would say, so the construction category in the budget is mostly there so that it helps us understand if you are wanting to use your funds for a construction project, because there are all sorts of other regulations that it would mean this project has to comply with. So any of the other categories, so whether, like you mentioned, you're hiring an engineer, you're contracting with someone to do the architectural drawings, if you are paying staff in any capacity to do this work, we ask that you put those in this construction category. Essentially look at all the other categories in the budget. If it can fit in there, you can assume that it's allowable within the grant. We just ask that you put it in that construction category so that we can kind of help you navigate all the other complex things that you might have to go through if you're doing a construction project with federal funds. I would say if you have like really specific questions about what may or may not be allowable with construction funds, whether it's purchasing something or whatever it might be, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to respond specifically.
I'll also just flag that we do have technical assistance centers who can also help with the specifics of those types of questions, particularly the Great Lakes. TICTAC has a partnership with an engineering firm as part of their technical assistance. So if you're interested in having maybe an overview by an organization with some expertise in that area, definitely reach out to the Great Lakes TICTAC that's housed at University of Minnesota. We can put that information in the chat too. Yep. Okay, great. Any other questions? Thanks, Ryan. Okay. Seeing no hands raised, and maybe you are thinking, feel free to reach out to the Great Lakes TCGM email that is in the chat. Feel free to reach out to your program directors of outreach, myself, Ryan, and Tori. Feel free to reach out to the TICTACs if you have any other questions. Again, March 30th is the next deadline. Go ahead, Kendra.
All right, last one, hopefully. We just kind of have a question. So since there's 3 tiers and you can apply for them all at the same time, is that like, is there a suggestion to do one at a time? Is applying for all three okay? Well, we already did 2, so I guess 1 and 3 would be in the next thing, but like, do you guys want us to only be doing 1 at a time, or like, is there preferral? Because they're all kind of interconnected, and that's where we've been really trying to like compartmentalize everything into the right tiers.
Sure. You can apply to as many tiers as you want to concurrently, but more than likely, because we do have a limited amount of funds, the maximum amount of awards any one organization or a partnership could receive, or one project, rather, to be more clear, could receive is up to 2 grants. And even that would be very rare. I would not expect that. So if you apply to a tier, we do recommend that you wait to hear back to see if you were awarded the grant or not. And of course, if you are not awarded the grant, you are welcome to reapply to that tier or a different tier based on the feedback that you may have from the grant maker. Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm not even going to try to wrap this time. Let's see what happens. Okay. I'm going to let you all go for real this time because I do see people hopping off, and I know Jumana had to go early, but again, reach out to any of the resources that we previously stated, the Tic Tacs, your outreach directors, the Minneapolis Foundation. And thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a good day and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thank y'all.